Okay, let's unpack this. The conversation around abortion, well, it's been everywhere recently, hasn't it? And you hear all sorts of claims, some sounding, very scientific.
Absolutely. So much information, so many different opinions flying around, things about like when a fetus might feel pain, descriptions of procedures, safety claims. It's a lot.
Right. And you've shared this big stack of sources with us, articles, studies, research papers, even notes from a clinic visit. So our mission here in this deep dive is to wade through all that material you gave us.
Yeah, to pull out the key bits of information, the actual science that's in there related to some of these really common points you hear.
We're really focusing just on what your sources tell us, like the nitty-gritty scientific details about fetal development at different times, what the procedures actually are.
The reasons people give for seeking abortions, what the data says about the real risks, and what the research, like that big turnaway study, actually found about how people do afterwards, long term.
Think of this as us cutting through the noise, just laying out the facts from your sources so you can be, really well informed on these specific points. Okay, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So one of the first things that jumps out from your sources is timing. Like, when do most abortions in the U.S. actually take place?
Yeah, the data on this is pretty consistent. The CDC numbers cited in the sources, they show the vast majority, over 90%, happen in the first trimester.
Over 90% in the first 12 weeks.
Exactly. And even more specifically, something like 60% happen really early within the first 8 weeks of gestational age.
Okay, 8 weeks. And gestational age, just so we're clear, based on the sources, it's counted from the first day of the last period, right?
Correct. That's the standard medical way they date pregnancies, even though, conception is actually a couple of weeks later.
Right. So 8 weeks. What does development look like then? When most abortions are actually happening, what are we talking about size-wise?
Well, at that point, according to the sources, it's technically still an embryo, and it's incredibly small, described as about 15 millimeters.
15 millimeters?
Yeah.
Like about the size of a pumpkin seed.
Exactly, yeah, like a pumpkin seed. So much smaller than maybe some people imagine.
Definitely. And obviously things are developing fast, but it's still very, very early stage.
Right.
Now, the sources mention the heart that starts developing around this time.
Yes, a very primitive structure starts to form. It begins as this sort of 2-chamber tube, then develops more chambers, 3 and 4. And it does start pumping blood cells.
But can you, see it beating? Is it visible?
The sources describe this early heart structure as microscopic at this 8-week stage. So while it's happening biologically, the pumping, it's not something you'd see with the naked eye. It's not like a miniature, fully formed heart yet.
That seems like a really important distinction for picturing this early stage.
Mm-hmm.
And what about that other thing, with the point about fingernails? That came up, I think, even in the Supreme Court opinion and maybe movies?
Ah, yes, the fingernail point. The sources directly tackle that. They say, while you might see some flat spots starting to form around 10 weeks, actual, recognizable fingernails, the kind you can see.
Yeah.
They don't appear until way, way later, closer to 32 weeks, according to the sources.
32 weeks. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's well into the third trimester. So
Right.
if most abortions happen at 8 weeks, pumpkin seed size, microscopic heart structure, or even by 10 weeks before real fingernails, what does that tell us, based only on these sources, about the physical reality?
It tells us that the level of physical development is extremely basic compared to maybe the image some people have in their heads when they hear fetus. It's a very, very different stage of biological organization.
Okay, that really grounds us in what the sources describe physically.
Yeah.
Now let's tackle something that feels central to so much of the debate: fetal pain. Your sources really dig into the science of what's actually needed to feel pain.
Yeah, this is where the sources get quite technical, but it's crucial. They lay out that experiencing pain isn't simple. You need, several components working together.
Okay, like what?
You need pain receptors, first, to even detect something potentially harmful. Then you need nerve fibers to carry that signal, up to the spinal cord and into the brain.
Right.
And then this is the key part. You need a brain cortex that's developed enough to actually receive that signal, process it, and interpret it as the feeling of pain. It's not just a reflex, it's conscious perception.
Okay, so the brain has to be wired up correctly and mature enough to basically understand, ouch.
Exactly. So if we look at the developmental timeline presented in the sources, nerve fibers do start developing pretty early, around 6 weeks, but they respond to touch, vibration, that kind of thing. The sources are clear. They do not transmit pain signals then.
Okay, so no pain signals at 6 weeks.
Right. Then maybe around 10 weeks, some immature pain receptors might start forming. But the sources state very clearly that before 10 weeks, experiencing pain is, quote, clearly not possible.
Got it. 10 weeks is the absolute earliest any part of that system appears, and even then it's immature. What about later? Can it feel pain after 10 weeks?
Well, the sources explain that even quite a bit later, say 18 to 20 weeks, you might see a physical reflex. Like if there's an amniocentesis needle poke, the fetus might withdraw.
Right, a movement.
But the sources stress that this is an involuntary reflex. It happens at the spinal cord level. The necessary brain pathways, and especially the cortex needed to consciously process that stimulus as pain, simply aren't developed yet.
So just because there's movement doesn't mean there's pain perception.
Precisely. The sources emphasize that the complex brain cortex, the part you need for that conscious experience, doesn't really develop significantly until the end of the second trimester. And the critical connections, the wiring between the lower brain structures and that cortex, they aren't fully complete until around 26 to 28 weeks.
26 to 28 weeks. So the bottom line from the science in these sources is that the brain literally isn't capable of processing pain until late in the second trimester.
That's the direct conclusion presented in the scientific reports that were cited. They state that based on all the evidence of neurological development, pain perception is not possible until after 24 weeks.
And if we put that together with the timing we just talked about, you said 99% of abortions happen before 24 weeks.
Exactly. It means that, based purely on the scientific data and reports included in your sources, fetal pain is not occurring in, well, virtually all abortions performed in the U.S. Understanding the biology needed for pain really clarifies this.
That's a really significant finding from the source material. Okay, let's shift then to what actually happens during an abortion. That Supreme Court opinion used some pretty strong language like gruesome or barbaric. How do the sources describe the actual procedures, especially for the majority happening early on?
Right. So focusing on the first trimester, where again, most abortions occur, the sources detail two main methods. First, there's medication abortion.
That's the one involving pills, right?
Exactly. Usually two different drugs, mifepristone and misoprostol. Mifepristone basically works by blocking a hormone, progesterone, which is essential. Yes. And then, usually a day or two later, misoprostol is taken. That drug causes the uterus to contract and expel the pregnancy tissue. The sources say it's medically very similar to an early miscarriage.
And what's the experience like for the person, according to the sources?
They note it's definitely not pleasant. There's clamping, bleeding, often heavier than a period, maybe nausea. But importantly, they also stress that numerous studies show it's very safe, complications are rare, and for early pregnancies, it can be done safely at home.
Is this the same as the morning after pill, Plan B?
No, and the sources are really clear about this distinction. Plan B works before pregnancy is established, mainly by delaying ovulation. Regular birth control prevents ovulation. These medication abortion pills work to end an already existing pregnancy. Totally different mechanisms.
Got it. Okay, what about the other common first trimester method, sometimes called surgical abortion?
Yeah, and the sources make a point about that word surgical. It doesn't usually mean cutting in the way we might think. Access is through the vagina and the cervix, the natural opening to the uterus.
Okay, so no incisions needed. How does it work then?
Well, the cervix, the opening, needs to be dilated, open just slightly. This can be done sometimes with medication beforehand or using thin tapered rods called dilators. They gently stretch the opening.
Right, and once it's open?
Then the pregnancy tissue is removed from the uterus.
Oh.
The sources describe using gentle suction. It could be a handheld syringe-like device creating suction, or sometimes a small tube connected to a suction machine, kind of like a vacuum. For slightly later first trimester cases, maybe small instruments like forceps or graspers might also be used.
And how long does this actual removal part take?
The sources say it's very quick. Especially early on, the procedure itself might only take, 30 seconds to maybe a couple of minutes.
Wow, that's fast. And what's actually removed at that early stage, like 8 weeks?
Well, like we said, it's pumpkin seed sized. So the sources describe seeing mostly tissue, the early placental tissue, the gestational sac. It's often described as looking like a small amount of whitish sort of fluffy tissue. You wouldn't typically see recognizable fetal parts until closer to 10 weeks or later in the first trimester.
Okay. Now, the sources do talk about later procedures too, right? Second trimester, which are less common.
Yes, they do. Those often involve a method called dilation and evacuation, or D&E, and that does typically involve using instruments to remove the fetus, which is larger at that stage.
And the descriptions are, I imagine, more complex for those.
Yes, the sources indicate that in these later procedures, because the fetus is more developed, instruments are used to remove it, sometimes in parts.
And there was that very personal story in the sources from a doctor performing a D&E.
There was, yeah. It was quite powerful. A doctor described performing a D&E on a patient who is about 4 months pregnant, similar to how far along the doctor herself was, and right in the middle of the procedure, she felt her own baby kick for the first time. Yeah. She wrote about the intense emotional weight of that moment, feeling life inside her while ending a pregnancy at a similar stage. It really highlighted the profound human complexity involved, even while she was describing the necessary medical steps.
That really does bring the human element right into it. The sources also mention third trimester abortions. Very rare, though.
Extremely rare. The CDC data cited puts it at only about 1% happening after 5 months. And the sources explain these are almost always due to very serious medical situations, like a severe fetal abnormality found late, or a major threat to the pregnant person's health. The procedure sometimes involves stopping the fetal heart first and then inducing labor.
So pulling it all together from the sources, the description of an abortion procedure really depends on the stage of pregnancy. The vast majority are these early, quick procedures using medication or suction, not the later, more complex ones that sometimes dominate the discussion.
That's definitely the key takeaway from the procedural descriptions provided. The reality varies hugely depending on how many weeks pregnant someone is.
Okay, let's shift from the how to the why. Why do people actually seek abortions?
Yeah.
Your sources had insights from clinics, from studies, and they seem to challenge some common ideas.
Absolutely. When you look at the data cited from places like the Guttmacher Institute and the interviews from clinic visits, it becomes clear the reasons are often really complex, often rooted in pretty difficult life circumstances.
And who is typically getting abortions? The demographics might surprise some people.
That's right. The sources show it's often not teenagers. The most common age group is women in their 20s and 30s. And here's a really striking statistic from the data. About 60% of people getting abortions in the U.S. are already mothers.
60%.
Yeah.
Already have children. That definitely reframes the decision, doesn't it? They're making it with the experience of raising kids.
It does. And when you look at the reasons they give in the studies, financial issues are huge. The inability to afford another child was cited as the biggest reason by 40% in one major study.
Nearly half. Primarily for financial reasons.
Yep. Other common reasons are things like the timing just not being right, feeling unprepared to care for a child or another child right then, or issues related to their partner.
Partner issues came up a lot in the sources.
Yeah, almost a third mentioned reasons connected to the father, often meaning a lack of a supportive relationship, or sometimes, really sadly, it involves situations of physical abuse.
That paints a picture of people often in pretty vulnerable spots.
Yeah.
There was that journal entry included in the sources from a clinic patient. It really brought that complexity to life.
It was very moving. It was from a single mom already raising 2 kids, and she wrote about just how hard she was struggling financially, just trying to keep food on the table. And she was also grappling with her religious beliefs, feeling abortion was wrong, but feeling she just couldn't manage another child. She wrote about her pain, her conflict, hoping for understanding. It underscores that these are not easy decisions, often involving deep personal struggles.
That entry really hits home, showing the human side of the stats. And you mentioned religion. The data on religious identity was also maybe not what people expect.
Yeah, it surprises many. The data presented shows quite significant numbers of people seeking abortions identify as religious. In the data cited, nearly a quarter identified as Catholic, about 17% as mainline Protestant, and 13% as evangelical Protestant.
So the picture from the sources is the reasons are varied, often economic, often tied to existing family responsibilities, and the decision cuts across all sorts of demographic and religious lines.
Exactly. It gives a much more nuanced view than some of the simpler narratives out there.
Okay, let's pivot to risks and safety. This comes up a lot, concerns about how safe abortion is. What does the research in your sources actually say, especially when you compare it to other things?
Right. The sources tackle some common fears directly using data, like the idea that having a safe legal abortion might cause infertility later on.
Is there evidence for that?
No, there isn't. Major medical organizations cited in the sources like the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in the UK, the U.S. National Academies of Science, they've looked at this extensively and find no link between having a safe, legal abortion and problems getting pregnant later.
Okay. What about the fear linking abortion to breast cancer?
Again, the sources point to a lot of research, including really large studies looking at thousands and thousands of women, and they have consistently found no increased risk of breast cancer after an abortion. So these specific fears, not backed up by the scientific evidence presented.
So those common worries aren't supported by the sources. What are the actual documented medical risks then?
Well, the sources mention the kinds of risks you see with many medical procedures, though they're rare with abortion. Things like bleeding, very rarely serious enough to need hospitalization, and infection. One large study cited found infection occurred in less than 2% of cases. So risks exist, but they're low.
Now, the dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court ruling talked about protecting maternal health. But the sources make a really striking comparison here, don't they, between the risk of abortion and the risk of actually carrying a pregnancy to term and giving birth.
Yes, this is honestly one of the most crucial data points in the sources. According to an analysis of CDC data that was cited, a person is about 13 times more likely to die from complications of childbirth than from a legal abortion.
13 times. More likely to die from childbirth than a legal abortion.
Yeah.
That really puts the relative safety discussion in a different light based on the data.
It absolutely does. And the sources add even more perspective, noting that statistically, you're more likely to die from some fairly common procedures, like certain types of dental surgery or even plastic surgery, than from a legal abortion. What's fascinating is how the data directly counters that common assumption that abortion is inherently a uniquely dangerous procedure compared to, well, even continuing the pregnancy.
And the sources also brought up ectopic pregnancies briefly.
Yes, just to mention that. An ectopic pregnancy is when the pregnancy implants outside the uterus, usually in a fallopian tube. It can't survive, and it's incredibly dangerous for the pregnant person. It must be removed. The sources just raise a concern that some new state laws restricting abortion might unintentionally delay or complicate getting that essential life-saving care.
So the clear takeaway from the data in your sources is that carrying a pregnancy to term actually carries significantly higher mortality risks than having a legal abortion.
That's what the data presented shows, yes.
Okay, what about life after an abortion? There's this idea out there, sometimes called post-abortion syndrome, suggesting long-term depression, guilt, PTSD. Personal stories definitely exist, but what does the large-scale research in the sources say about how common that really is?
This is where the sources really lean on that landmark piece of research, the Turnaway study. It was a big deal, a very well-designed study that followed almost 1,000 women from 30 different clinics across the U.S. for 5 full years.
And the key thing was who they followed, right?
Exactly. They tracked women who wanted and received an abortion, and they tracked women who wanted an abortion but were turned away, usually because they were just past the clinic's gestational limit.
So they could directly compare the outcomes for those two groups over time.
Precisely. And when they looked at mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, self-esteem, the results were really clear. Over the 5 years, they found no evidence that having an abortion caused worse mental health outcomes compared to being denied one.
No evidence of long-term mental health harm from the abortion itself compared to those turned away. That strongly contradicts the idea of a widespread post-abortion syndrome.
It really does. The sources explicitly state the study found the notion of widespread lasting regret to be unfounded. The data actually showed the opposite. The vast majority of participants, over 95% after 3 years, and this held up over 5 years, reported that having the abortion was the right decision for them.
So years later, overwhelmingly, the feeling was relief and certainty it was the right choice.
That's what the Turnaway study data indicated. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the study didn't find significant differences in long-term mental health between the groups, it found major differences in other life outcomes. Specifically, economic outcomes.
Like what?
Women who were denied abortions and went on to give birth were significantly more likely to experience financial hardship, like being below the poverty line, needing public assistance, and less likely to be employed full-time compared to the women who received the abortions they sought. And these differences really emerged after the birth.
Wow. So being denied the abortion often led to significantly worse economic situations for those women and their existing children, according to this study.
That was a major finding, yes. And there was another important point about relationships. For women who were seeking an abortion partly because of an abusive partner, getting the abortion often helped them sever ties with that abusive partner. The study found that violence from that partner dropped precipitously for the women who were able to get the abortion compared to those who were turned away and often remained connected to the abusive partner through the child.
That's a really powerful unintended consequence, or maybe intended for some. So the overall conclusion from the Turnaway study, as presented in your sources.
It suggests that, look, women often make this decision because they know, for various reasons, financial, relationship, timing, they aren't ready or able to have a child right then. The decision isn't easy, but the research shows having the abortion doesn't appear to cause long-term mental health issues, whereas being denied the abortion can lead to significant negative consequences, especially economically and sometimes in terms of safety.
That Turnaway study provides such a wealth of evidence-based insight into what actually happens in people's lives after seeking an abortion.
Yeah, it's a really important study because it's grounded in tracking real people's experiences and outcomes over years.
Okay, finally. Your sources mentioned something they felt was often missing from the public discussion around restricting abortion access. What was that?
It was the significant body of historical research and sociological studies looking at what actually happens when legal abortion becomes unavailable or severely restricted.
And what does that research show?
The consistent finding, according to the sources, is that making abortion illegal doesn't necessarily make it go away.
Yeah.
The number of abortions often doesn't drop dramatically.
It doesn't. So what happens?
They just become much, much riskier, unsafe. The sources point back to the era before Roe v. Wade in the U.S. They recount stories, evidence of dangerous, desperate things women resorted to drinking chemicals like turpentine, using knitting needles, coat hangers, leading to horrific injuries, sepsis, hemorrhage, and death.
And the impact on hospitals back then.
The sources mention it was so bad that many major hospitals literally had dedicated wards, sometimes called septic abortion wards, just to treat the constant stream of women suffering from the consequences of these unsafe, illegal procedures.
That's a really sobering picture of the past.
It is. And while the sources acknowledge things are different now, the internet exists, medication abortion pills can sometimes be ordered online, the fundamental conclusion from the historical evidence presented is that restricting legal, safe access is likely to drive abortions underground and make them more dangerous, not eliminate them.
So this deep dive, we've really walked through your sources piece by piece, trying to unpack the science around abortion, hitting those key points that come up so often.
Yeah, we've looked at the timelines for fetal development, what the science says about when pain is even biologically possible, what the different procedures actually entail at different stages.
The documented reasons people seek abortions, the hard data on risks compared to childbirth, and what those big long-term studies like Turnaway tell us about life afterwards. And just to reiterate, everything we talked about was drawn directly from the sources you provided.
Right, representing a pretty significant amount of research some of those papers had, like over 140 citations behind them.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but hopefully breaking it down like this gives you, the listener, a much clearer picture based on the actual scientific evidence presented in the source material.
Yeah, getting that evidence out there was really the goal.
So, as you think about everything we've discussed today, maybe especially that data from the sources on the relative risks of pregnancy versus abortion, or those economic and life consequences found by the Turnaway study, what does the science presented really suggest about the tangible, real-world impacts on people's lives when access to abortion changes? That's maybe something to mull over.
It's certainly a consequence the data prompts us to consider carefully.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, for walking through these important facts from the source material you shared with us.
We really hope this has been a valuable, informative look based purely on the science presented in those sources.